For centuries after the apostles wrote their letters and gospels, the words of the New Testament were passed from hand to hand across the ancient Mediterranean. Papyrus sheets crinkled under the touch of early believers, rolled scrolls traveled through desert heat and sea winds, and small gatherings in homes listened to these words read aloud, sometimes from a new copy, sometimes from a copy of a copy, sometimes from a manuscript already worn from years of devotion. No one imagined a single, fixed New Testament text. There were simply writings that the churches treasured, copied, and shared as faithfully as human hands and eyes allowed. As generations passed, the manuscripts multiplied. Some traveled with merchants to Alexandria, where Christian scholars and Jewish scribes lived amid the intellectual energy of the Great Library. Others moved through Asia Minor, Syria, or Rome. Still, others remained hidden in monastic cells carved into desert cliffs. In each region, the text took on small marks from the communities that preserved it. Spellings adapted, phrases harmonized, mistakes corrected, notes added for clarity. The story of the early New Testament was not the story of a single text, but the story of many witnesses singing in overlapping voices. By the 4th and 5th centuries, great parchment codices appeared, majestic books containing all the scriptures within 2 covers. Their pages, handwritten with stunning precision, preserve some of the earliest surviving versions of the New Testament. Codex Sinaiticus, discovered centuries later beneath the dust of an Egyptian monastery, contained words closer in time to the apostles than any manuscript the Western world had ever seen. Codex Vaticanus, quietly resting in the Library of Rome, included readings from nearly the earliest centuries of the Church's history. These ancient witnesses, largely forgotten, sat in near silence for over 1,000 years. Meanwhile, the medieval church relied on the manuscripts available to them, mostly later copies, mainly from the Byzantine tradition. The invention of the printing press brought consistency. Erasmus printed his Greek text in 1516, which became the basis of the Textus Receptus. That printed version influenced the Reformation and the Bibles of Europe for generations. However, it only told part of the story because Erasmus never saw the earliest manuscripts. He worked with the witnesses he had, faithful but late, beautiful but far removed from the earliest centuries of Christian history. For 3 centuries after the Reformation, the world believed that the printed Greek text was the Greek New Testament, unaware that older manuscripts lay hidden in forgotten places. But then the world shifted. During the 18th and 19th centuries, explorers, scholars, and monks began uncovering manuscripts that had remained untouched for ages, beneath the sands of Egypt, in the libraries of ancient churches, and tucked away in the recesses of monasteries. Scholars discovered papyrus fragments and ancient codices that brought the text much closer to the time of the apostles. There were fragile sheets of papyrus written in uneven but ancient handwriting, bearing verses from John's Gospel, Paul's letters, and the Gospels. These papyri were not smooth or uniform. They displayed the marks of a living text, rough edges, hurried strokes, and a closeness to the earliest Christian communities. They told a story older than the Byzantine tradition and older than the printed Textus Receptus. It was as if the early church itself had started to speak again. At this moment, a new question arose. If all these manuscripts, thousands of them, spoke in slightly different voices, how could the earliest form of the New Testament be recovered? It was no longer enough to rely on a single printed edition, or to assume that the most familiar text was the oldest. Scholars began to gather every manuscript they could find and compare them line by line, word by word, letter by letter. They listened to the earliest papyri from Alexandria, the sturdy majesty of the great uncials, the wide witness of ancient translations into Syriac, Coptic, and Latin, and the quotations of early Christian writers scattered across the first centuries. Amidst this wide chorus of witnesses, a new method emerged: textual criticism, the careful science of assessing the age, quality, geography, and lineage of manuscripts to reconstruct the earliest possible text. The aim was not to produce something new, but to recover something ancient, the text as it probably existed before generations of copying altered its later forms. In the 19th century, scholars such as Tischendorf, Tregelles, and Westcott and Hort paved the way. Tischendorf saved Codex Sinaiticus from almost being destroyed. Westcott and Hort examined the manuscripts carefully to produce a Greek text based on the earliest evidence instead of printed tradition. Their work was initially controversial, but became highly influential, creating a bridge to the modern era of textual scholarship. In the 20th century, this work developed into two major scholarly editions of the Greek New Testament, the Nestle-Aland, NA, and the United Bible Societies, UBS. Instead of relying on a single manuscript family, these editions sourced from all known material, including the earliest papyri, the great uncials, the best minuscules, ancient lectionaries, quotes from the Church Fathers, and translations made by Christians long before the fall of the Roman Empire. Scholars formed committees to compare variants, evaluate evidence, and document every important difference in detailed apparatuses. The result was not a perfect text. Perfection remains out of reach, but the earliest possible version, a reconstruction shaped by the broadest and deepest collection of evidence the world had ever seen. The NA/UBS text does not claim to be final. It provides a window into the first centuries of the New Testament's history, improved with every new discovery, but grounded in a careful review of everything the ancient world preserved. Today, when a modern translation of the New Testament is created, be it ESV, NIV, NASB, CSB, NRSV, NET, or many others, the translators start with the critical text. They rely not on a single manuscript or tradition, but on the combined testimony of thousands of ancient voices, dating back to within decades or centuries of the apostles themselves. It is the text shaped not by one era, but by many, not by one tradition, but by the entire flow of history. And so the critical text stands alongside the Tanakh, the Masoretic text, and the Textus Receptus, not as a rival, but as another chapter in the long human story of preserving Scripture. It is the story of dust-covered papyri, awakening after centuries of silence, of manuscripts whispered over by generations of monks, of scholars hunched over dim lamplight, comparing lines with care, and of a global effort to hear the earliest echoes of the New Testament once again. It is the modern expression of an ancient devotion, that the words passed down from the apostles might be recovered as faithfully and transparently as possible, not through one manuscript, but through the entire legacy of the Church's textual inheritance.